This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. Hey, we are talking about Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan today, published in 1651. It is a very big book on the partially examined life. In a very early episode, we covered some of the famous parts on the social contract, the politics part, but we never really looked at the very beginning of the book, which is sort of a classic epistemology. This is just only 10 years after Descartes' Meditations came out. And so I chose to have us start with chapter 5, Reason and Science, that I thought if we were going to get just a little bit, then having somebody who is a classical empiricist, right? There's nothing in the mind that wasn't in the senses. That's right there in chapter 1. Have him talk about how does he give an account of what seems like a very complicated thing based on that very simple epistemology. Had you read this part of the book ever, Wes, to your knowledge?
Not that I know of. It's possible that I did it as an undergrad, but I know.
Well, you want to start us off? This is the PDF we're sending around is at earlymoderntexts.com. It just, it was written in English, obviously, but most of the versions you'll find online have extra E's and it's just archaic spelling. So at least this version gets rid of that. So chapter 5, page 16 of that.
All right. Chapter 5, Reason and Science. When a man reasons, all he does is to conceive a sum total from the addition of portions, or conceive a remainder from the subtraction of one sum from another. If this is done in words, it is conceiving the name of the whole as coming from the names of all the parts, or conceiving the name of one part as coming from the names of the whole and the other part.
Let's stop right there just for a second. So, I did skim the earlier chapters. Right before this is one on speech, and it's what you would expect, that if ideas are used correctly, they're going to correspond exactly to what was in the senses, right? Even the imagination, which is chapter 2, just talks about, well, you got your simple imagination is basically memory, right? It was what was in the senses, or compound imagination is when we put things that were in the senses together, like a centaur is our memory of a horse, our memory of a person. And so names lines right up to that if words are being used correctly, then each word corresponds to a simple idea that corresponds to a sensation that you actually had, a thing out in the world. And once you diverge from that, once you abstract, that's when things go wrong. So there we go. We're trying to use a very mathematical approach here. Just talk about putting ideas together, removing them from each other. Proceed.
Okay. I think I said addition of parts, and he says addition of portions. So we're adding or subtracting ideas from one another. Is that the context?
Well, here, yeah. Right, one sum from another. If this is done with words, then it is conceiving the name of the whole as coming from the names of the parts.
So a definition, or a definition in terms of parts?
Yeah, I think so. So or meaning, if you want to just use a more normal sounding word for that.
So the name of one part is coming from the name of the whole on the other part. What's an example of that?
I mean, I think this is just, if you think
it sounds like genus species stuff.
Well, the meaning of a name is just what it refers to. So a name is just a meaning for an idea and hence an object that it refers to. So I think names is maybe not helpful here, except that the meaning of simple word, you could just call it a name for that kind of perception.
Right. But I'm just trying to think of an example here. Is this genus species stuff, conceiving the name of one part from the names of the whole and the other part? So if it's a tiger, the name of the whole is the, whatever the, maybe big cat. Let's not be scientific.
I guess I wasn't thinking of that. I was thinking that in terms of what is the name of a sentence? Again, this is a very weird way of putting it. Well, that comes from the names, the meanings of the individual parts of the sentence. Or
okay,
yeah, so a compound. So maybe tiger is the addition of pig plus cat plus stripes or something. But
okay. But your interpretation sounds a little more Fregean in the sense of, you could have the thought as for Frege, that would be the referent or the
right,
but corresponding to a proposition, and then according to some calculus or other. Anyway, let's move on and see. Maybe this will become clear. For some things, such as numbers, we have not only adding and subtracting, but also names for other operations, such as multiplying and dividing. Yet these are not wholly new operations, for multiplication is merely adding equal things together, and division is nothing but subtracting one thing as often as we can. These operations are performed not only with numbers, but with all sorts of things that can be added together and subtracted one from another. Just as arithmeticians teach how to add and subtract in numbers, so the geometricians teach how to do the same with lines, figures, 2- and 3-dimensional, angles, proportions, times, degrees of speed, force, power, and their like. The logicians teach the same with respect to sequences of words, adding together two names to make an affirmation, two affirmations to make a syllogism, and many syllogisms to make a proof. And from the sum or conclusion of a syllogism, they subtract one proposition to find the other. Okay, so this is the option we had not explored with regard to adding and subtracting. So it's syllogistic.
Well, it's very wide. Yes, they thinking about a triangle as the addition of, you've got a line, you got another line, you got some particular angles. Or is it the concept of angle in general plus the concept of some degrees? I don't know. It has to include the fact that the angles of the triangle add up to 180 degrees.
Well, you have me trying to remember my Euclid and the general nature of the sorts of proofs that we were doing with that. This is something I studied in college as well. So running through all of the geometric proofs, and book 1 of Euclid kind of adds up in the end to the proof of the Pythagorean theorem. But I think, you could justify what Hobbes is saying here. A lot of this is about comparing areas and angles, and there is, in a sense, a lot of addition and subtraction, and I'd have to think carefully about that in relation to geometric proof. But my hunch is that you could make an argument supporting Hobbes here on this one, in thinking about geometric proof in that way. But
sure, a proof looks like an addition problem. You've got some things that are above the line, you got the conclusion that's below the line, but I don't think he's saying that adding up the various premises gives you the conclusion like an addition problem. It seemed to be saying that adding up all the different lines, including the conclusion, gives you the proof. So it's a different.
Well, now we're talking about the syllogism, right? So I was thinking of geometry there. So let's think about it with the syllogism. Yeah, is that an accurate way of describing a syllogism? Is addition and subtraction, at this point, it's just become metaphor, right? That idea.
He really doesn't like metaphor, so hopefully not. Two affirmations. Two names to make an affirmation. That's what I was saying before, that if you say John runs, then you're adding the name John.
Okay.
And the name, in quotes, runs, referring to that sort of action to make the sentence John runs. Two affirmations to make a syllogism. Well, it seems actually you need 3 affirmations to make the syllogism, one of which is the conclusion, unless you say the product, the conclusion, is the syllogism, which I don't think is how they use.
Well, let's start with just the affirmation, right? Take a proposition.
All men are mortal.
All men are mortal, or something has property P, or however you want to do it. Yeah, that's not the way a contemporary logician would think of subject and predicate. Subject and predicate are in a sense radically different. They're radically different for someone who wants to do traditional ontology or metaphysics, but they're also radically different in the predicate calculus, right? So, in other words, the way a property and an object are combined is properties implicate universals. The way they're combined is not just simply by sticking them together. It's, in the calculus, it's there exists an X such that I don't even know how you would put it. But anyway, the form of a predicate would be, f of X or something like that, where there's a variable that an object can fill in, but in the sense the predicate is incomplete until it gets filled in by a concrete object. Anyway, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but just obviously it's not just addition. The proposition is a structured thing. It's not just,
right,
hey, here's two things on equal terms that we're just conglomerating. It's not the way it is.
Yes, a conglomeration, a concatenation, a heap, as opposed to a sum, which implies that the things being added together are of the same type, so that you can actually have 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. That is a legitimate sum. But 1 + dog plus banana, I mean, yeah, it's 3 objects, but I'm still just adding the numbers there. I'm not actually adding the things in question there.
Yeah. 2 affirmations to make a syllogism. Again, I wouldn't describe the relationship between, the 2 affirmations in a syllogism is simply addition. But go ahead.
Banana plus justice plus 15 moles of pure silver. Like, you can't add those things. You can't just say those are 3 entities. Justice does.
Right.
Anyway.
But when we add, all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, again, that's not addition.
Mm-hmm.
The way those 2 things interrelate logically is not additive. But so I think the best defense we can give of him is metaphor here, although maybe some listeners will know. I'm sure it'd be really interesting to see what scholars have to say about this. People trying to defend an additive conception in some sense, but.
All right, continuing on this paragraph, writers on politics add together treatises and agreements to find men's duties, and lawyers add together laws and facts to find what is right and wrong in the actions of private men. In brief, wherever there is a place for addition and subtraction, there is also a place for reasoning, and where these have no place, reason has nothing to do. So what he's sort of saying, okay, what I meant by addition and subtraction is reasoning, but it's a little hard to see how that is an illuminative definition for reasoning, right? If you want to say reasoning is just addition and subtraction, well, for all the reasons we've just been giving, it doesn't look like it. It looks like you'd have to have a very expansive notion of what addition and subtraction amount to, such that you might as well define it in terms of reasoning, which would be a circular definition. So that can't be what's going on.
Well, it's clear he thinks that addition and subtraction are sort of, in a sense, necessary conditions for reasoning. Sufficient is unclear. Whether they're sufficient, right? Whether he's not saying where there is addition and subtraction, there you have reasoning. That's reasoning for you. He's saying there's a place for reasoning. So suitably vague. So suitably vague such that we can think of this metaphorically, or we can think of it as a general framework. It's fine to think of, does reasoning require us to combine 2 elements together? Sure. Is it, but do we have to say something more about it? Right? Does that explain the relationship between premises and a syllogism? No, it doesn't. It's more than mere combination. Although, again, if we looked at, what are we doing when we add 1 + 1, and we could think about Russell and Whitehead and the attempt to reduce arithmetic to logic, right? And Peano's axioms. What is it? In a way, and maybe that works against Hobbes. Maybe, in fact, addition and subtraction have to be conceived of ultimately in terms of logic rather than the other way around. But in any case.
Out of all of this, we can define, that is to say, fix, what is meant by the word reason, taken as naming one of the faculties of the mind. For reason, in this sense, is nothing but calculating, that is, adding and subtracting, sequences of general names agreed on to mark and signify our thoughts, mark them when we calculate them by ourselves, and signify them when we are demonstrating or recommending our calculations to other men. So mark and signify are things that already came up in the previous chapter on speech. Is just, what do we need speech for? Well, to remember stuff ourselves and also to communicate them. So he's not introducing those here, but still, it does look like we're defining reason is nothing but calculating. So in other words, the addition and subtraction, the calculation is not only necessary, but is sufficient. But what are we adding and subtracting? Sequences of general names agreed on to mark and signify. In other words, sequences of names that should have clear reference ultimately in what we have perceived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just, again, I don't want to beat this dead horse, but saying it's nothing but calculating, that is adding and subtracting. If you're making a very general point, maybe that's fine, but it doesn't tell you about the fine grain of reason. It doesn't tell you how to distinguish it from math, from syllogistic, for instance. He hasn't done that. He hasn't told us that. And it sounds like he's trying to be obstinately simple.
Those extra examples.
Maybe I'm not. And then, and then he adds to that this theory of language or signification, which is, I think, problematic. The idea that we have thoughts that we mark and that signification is only a matter of communication with others. We can't mark our thoughts except through signification, except through conceiving of ourselves in that situation of communication with another, even if it's only in fantasy or in some other respect. I mean, it's part of the point of a lot of what we've done on language, not just recently, but through the course of the partially examined life, is that this is not the way language works. It's not that we're just starting with these free-floating, pure thoughts and then we stick labels on them, which is what his theory sounds like.
Right. We have sensations and we capture them in thoughts and then capture those thoughts in language. So that it enables us to therefore actually remember stuff and, a fixity and to communicate it. What did you think of those extra examples at the end of the previous paragraph? Writers on politics add together treatises and agreements to find men's duties. Lawyers add together laws and facts to find what is right and wrong in the actions of private men, which you have to have. You don't believe in the is-ought distinction, definitely, if you think that you could do a syllogistic, what am I supposed to do? Well, let's look at what I have agreed on. Let's look at what the laws are and what the salient facts are, and therefore I can deduce what my duties are.
Yeah, again, addition is a word that doesn't tell us a lot. So yeah, we bring a particular under a universal, right? This is what he's describing. This is what Kant calls judgment. In a legal case, it's just a general case of bringing a particular under a universal. So we find some fact and we say, okay, this law applies, and then draw a conclusion from that. But bringing a fact under a law is not just sticking them together again. Why insist on this framework of addition unless you have more to say? And maybe he does.
Well, go on.
Out of all this, we can define, that is to say, fix, what is meant by the word.
We just read that one. It's the next one.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
people who are not practiced in arithmetic are bound to make mistakes and get wrong answers. And even expert arithmeticians can do so. Similarly, in any other subject of reasoning, the ablest, most careful, and most practiced men can deceive themselves and infer false conclusions. This is not to deny that reason itself is always right reason, but no one man's reason, nor even the reason of any group of men, however large, makes the conclusion certain. Similarly, arithmetic itself is a certain and infallible art. But no calculation is guaranteed to be right just because a great many men have unanimously approved it. So when there is a controversy about some calculation, the disputants must, on their own initiative, agree on some arbitrator or judge whose reason they will accept as right reason, since no standard for right reason has been set up by nature. And the same thing holds in all debates of every kind. All right.
Yeah, let's stop there.
That took a turn that I didn't expect.
It sounds like he's saying reason is objective. I mean, in other words, I'm not denying that reason itself is always right reason, but as a practical matter, we can't know. So in other words, what reason really sort of the right answer, which clearly it has to be something that can be more complicated than arithmetic, because arithmetic, we really can know. But he wants to say that all complex relations in mathematics, which of course, experienced arithmeticians can get a very complicated thing wrong, and they might reproduce each other's work wrongly, or they might independently come to wrong answers, but there still is going to be objectively a right answer. So we just have to have, for practical purposes, we have to say, this committee, they really know what they're doing. They're the wise arithmeticians among us. We're just going to take their word for it because no standard for right reason has been set up by nature.
It sounds like a very weird thing to say. But also the other weird part about this is if you are saying that we are fallible, right? That's a great and well-respected move. The next move is probably not to make some kind of appeal to authority or some appeal to some small group of people who happen to be in the know, even if it's experts, even if it's people with credentials. If you're Mill, for instance, you would say that the authority lies in the discursive process itself, or, in a process of trial and error, experimentation over time. There's a cross-temporal and even intergenerational discursive process, and the truth will out. That is the standard, the process. Dialogue, including dialogue and all the rest of it. But to say that we know how it works, if individual human beings are fallible, so are committees and judges. So anyway.
So you could say something like Charles Sanders Peirce does is, it's not the standard is not set up by nature. In other words, there's nothing that we can all just look to. But right before that, he said there is objectively a right answer. And so if we want to put that in terms of practice, we could, like Peirce does, say, well, it's what this committee would come up with if given indefinitely long to mull on it, right? That is the thing toward which they are shooting. And it seems like he's such an empiricist that he would have to. Otherwise, what is his justification for saying that reason in itself is always correct, even though no individual reasoner? I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that makes Kant or Plato or somebody say, well, then we can't be getting the idea of reason from experience at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, as a practical matter, right, a committee, yes, in a sense, right? This is the one we've talked about, another pet thing of mine, conspiracy theories before, but the conspiracy theorist rejects all authority as potentially tainted by some sort of diabolical interest. So if climate change is a scientific consensus, their tendency is to reject that. Because scientists are political, and because of this and because of that, and elements of paranoia, I think. I think, if you want to defend Hobbes, you'd have to appeal to the fact that we are all reliant on others for knowledge, right? We can't just do all the experiments ourselves and be scientists of lone scientists doing our own thing. And so we ultimately do have to appeal to a scientific consensus. We do have to appeal to people with credentials and some kind of authority. So I just wanted to give both sides of that argument. I think they're both actually legitimate. The anti-authoritarian argument with respect to knowledge, but also the one that I just gave, the anti-conspiratorial argument. It's a matter of finding a balance. So,
right. Continuing, and when men who think themselves wiser than everyone else clamor and demand that right reason be the judge, yet actually seek that things should be settled by their reason and no one else's, it is as intolerable in the society of men as it would be in a card game if, after trumps had been settled, someone always played as trumps whatever suit he had most of in his hand at the moment. For that's what people are doing when they insist, in any controversies they are involved in, that their strongest passion at a given moment shall count just then as right reason, revealing their lack of right reason by the claim they lay to it. Very well said.
Yeah. Yeah, this reminds me of of a op-ed in the New York Times written a while ago that really pissed me off by this philosopher who I'm not going to even name his name, but he was arguing against free speech, I think, and he had some things to say about how everyone is irrational and how Mill underestimated the irrationality of human beings, which is totally false. That reflects a complete lack of engagement with Mill. But his ultimate argument was, look, all these other people are just crazy, but not me. I'm the standard. I'm the rational one. That was ultimately what is I and others like me, and whether or not we're offended by certain things are the ultimate standard of rationality. And we feel passionately about this, and that's that. And this is the move people often make. I think psychologically Hobbes is right on here. You could write a whole essay on the psychology of this, how people equate their own irrational proclivities and their passions for this or that with rationality itself, because other people are just crazy. I feel strongly about this, therefore you're crazy.
Well, yeah, and we've seen that in Ayn Rand and with so-called logic bros, people who are haven't. Oh, it's just common sense. It's just marriage is between a man and a woman. It's just the definition. This kind of thing, pointing at some sort of imagined objective standard and it can't be then that the alternative is just it's whatever anybody says. It has to be. I think we've seen the seeds of it. The thing I was referring to from Peirce is, well, okay, I'm not perfectly reasonable, but that doesn't mean that I'm not more reasonable than everybody else. It's just I could be wrong. I mean, so I'm trying to leave room for, I don't want to see everything else, but the people that he's specifically arguing against, right? You have to look at what the, right? If you want to say, does reason itself tells you that a flat earther theory is wrong? I mean, not technically, not deductively. And if you have a very tight epistemology like Hobbes is, I mean, what experiences do you have to have directly to prove that the earth is round? I mean, you have to walk around the whole earth. You have to at least fly around the whole earth, but it seems there's still room for somebody could have fooled you. Are you keeping an eye on the ground? Did you close your eyes for a little bit? Maybe the pilot did something tricky to just take you back in a circle in the flat earth. So you're arriving.
Did you watch the Flat Earther documentary? I forgot. It was on some streaming service, and they were doing experiments, and they came up with one good experiment, which is that you put a bunch of big pylons in a row over a long distance, and you drill holes in them and you shine a laser through them, and it should go straight through if the Earth is flat. But eventually it's going to miss the hole of one of the pylons, right? If there's curvature, because the laser itself is not going to curve. And what was the result of that experiment? Of course, it showed curvature. And the flat earthers are really depressed. And what did they say? Well, we must have really messed up the experiment. Let's go back to the drawing board and figure out what we did wrong. Not, okay, we've just shown that the Earth is round. There are ways, of course, to know. There's a very simple experiment to know that the Earth is round. I mean, it was performed in, thousands of years ago by I forget which ancient Greek guy, but and it involves looking at the shadows cast by a stick in the ground. You could do it at the same time in two different locations, and if the Earth were flat, those shadows, I think, would be the same length. Anyway, I probably got that wrong, but that's the kind of gist of that. So I think so you're talking about, well, what that in a way, these are theoretical. If it's not acquaintance, right? Maybe if you fly up a plane and you see the curvature of the Earth, you find that somewhat convincing. But the once you go down, once you're doing theoretical stuff and experiments and scientific experiments, in a way, room for doubt just creeps in, right? Yeah, if I made an experimental error? I'm not seeing a round Earth. I'm just seeing shadows from a stick. But anyway, go ahead.
Exactly. No, acquaintance belies the optical illusions and things. Is what you have to interpret your acquaintance, that just because the Earth looks curved when I'm up high in a plane or something, well, that's just the consistency of the air. It's the light passing through the air makes it look like it's curved when really it's not.
Yeah, it just reinforces the point that I was making about, because I thought a lot about the flat Earth thing too with respect to conspiracy theories, and just that even knowledge like that, it's not our individual knowledge. We really are reliant on other people and indirect report. Mm-hmm. The Earth is round. We know that because we've been told it. And it's not that we just trust everyone willy-nilly, but we trust a kind of chain of custody, and we trust that we wouldn't have been systematically deceived, partly because it's psychologically implausible. People wouldn't be motivated to do that. It would be very difficult for them to do that. And that's where we get, it's that psychology or the feeling that we understand others in that way that gives us some assurance about the roundness of the Earth. It's not because we know all the experiments or that we've had direct acquaintance with it. So okay, I feel like I'm getting off track. How does that relate to what Hobbes just said?
No, it's an important point about people who lay claim to reason when reason is actually something that is transcendent. But what does that actually mean? Does that mean nobody can know it? Or at least we're somehow not referring directly to reason, right? We're somehow figuring it out. How do we know that a mathematical equation works? Does it produce? I want to give a pragmatic response that's the correct way to do empiricism. Empiricism drives us to pragmatism. How I know that 1 + 1 = 2 with certainty, because every single practical thing that you try to do, every experiment that you run confirms that. And so that gives you a foundation for understanding how addition in general works. And again, to extend the metaphor, it's a metaphor to logical deduction and to all these other things is the same, insofar as the edifice just gets too complicated. There could be a mathematical equation that is so complicated that even the expert mathematicians cannot agree on whether it actually works, makes sense, what the solution here, or how to prove, a very difficult thing in geometry or logic. Yeah. So I'm not sure what he's probably just going to have to say. Look, that's just beyond our capabilities as humans to figure out something that's that complicated. Maybe we just need to simplify. Luckily, what I'm going to do in proving, that government is legitimate, actually, it's pretty simple in the scheme of things.
Right.
You want to keep going? What reason is
for? What reason is for, and the right way to use it, is not to find the added up truth of one or just a few word sequences that are remote from the first definitions and settled meanings of names, but to begin with the latter and proceed from one sequence to another. All right, let's just stop here because
it sounds like Descartes' rules for the direction of the mind, right? You start with a simple thing, you move to another simple thing. Don't just put a bunch of things together and get a really complicated thing because you don't know what you're talking about at that point.
Oh, so begin with the latter, the settled meanings of names.
Yes.
Yes, once again, I have this antecedent problem. All right. For one can't be certain of the final conclusion without being certain of all the affirmations and negations from which it was inferred. Suppose that the master of a household, when making up his accounts, adds up the sums of all the bills of expense into one large sum, without looking into how each bill has been added up by those who presented them to him, or into what he is paying for in each. He does himself no more good than if he just accepted the bottom line sum as calculated for him by an accountant, trusting the skill and honesty of all the accountants. There's no point in checking some parts of the calculation if one doesn't check them all. In the same way, someone who is reasoning about anything, starts by taking on trust the conclusions of authors and doesn't derive them for himself from the proper starting points in every calculation, namely the meanings of names as settled by definitions. So he who doesn't do that wastes his labor, and at the end of it all, he doesn't know anything but merely believes.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out.
So we got to check all the parts of the calculation, and so drill down analytically to the very most fundamental elements, I think, right? And
yes.
in the case of the accounting, it would be I guess line items on the actual bills, and you have to verify do inventory. I don't know how that works. But,
yeah, I mean, I make sure that the people who are, you're running a car wash and it's a cash business. Were people somehow cheating? Were they letting their friends in for free? Are they conversely laundering money and just accepting money and not actually washing the cars?
Yeah.
You might not be able to tell. You have to trust at some point. But I like the antecedent of his sentence. You're going to have to take on faith. You're going to have to take the word of other people, as we were just saying. If you want to show that the world is round, there's a bunch of things that you probably are premises that you're not going to be able to check directly. Checking the names against the things, as an empiricist would like you to do.
Yeah.
Personal acquaintance.
And that seems what he's calling for, right?
Yep.
So, and this idea that you can start with definitions, I think, is also bogus. But we don't need to talk about that right now. One thing I will say, by the way, is Hobbes is surprisingly readable. Do you remember him this way?
Well, I think it helps that I picked this quote unquote translation.
But it's just the spellings, right?
I think yes. I think it is.
I hope that, okay.
That are changed.
It doesn't sound, as archaic as I remember. But anyway, go ahead.
Suppose a man is calculating without the use of words. This is possible in relation to particular things, as when on seeing one thing, you conjecture what was likely to have preceded it, or is likely to follow it. If what he thought likely to follow doesn't follow, or what he thought likely to have preceded it didn't proceed, this is called error, and even the most prudent men are subject to it. But when we are reasoning in words with general meanings, if we employ a general inference that is false, though this will commonly be called error, it is really an absurdity or senseless speech. For error is merely going wrong in presuming that something is past or to come, something which, even if in fact it is neither past nor to come, it is not impossible so far as we can discover. But when we make a general assertion, unless it is a true one, the possibility of it is inconceivable. and words by which we conceive nothing but the sound are what we call absurd, insignificant, and nonsense. Let's talk about that before we get to the example here.
Yes, this idea of nonsense became a favorite whipping boy, right, of analytic philosophers. You're not even wrong. It's what you're saying isn't even meaningful. And maybe if you're early Wittgenstein, it goes for all of philosophy. It's not even meaningful. But and I think this Hobbes, type of thing is an influence there. But in this case, I'm a little unclear so far, and maybe the examples will make it clear about what he's on about here. There are particular factual errors about the past or about predictions about the future. Okay. That's not nonsense. That's just error. Nonsense is when we do what? It sounds like when
you put it in words. I mean, when you make a generalization and you put it in words. So you might ask, why is this nonsense? So, if the dog and this using words or using thoughts without the use of words, this is something that the dog can do as well. So if the dog associates, I am now, he put the food down, therefore he's going to put he put my bowl down in front of me, therefore he's going to put food in that bowl, because that's just the way that it always happens. We can have an expectation. If it doesn't happen, if the dog owner gets distracted, well, the dog was just wrong there. But if we were to, or the dog had the capability to put it into, make a generalization about, whenever the bowl is put down, then food is sure to follow. He's saying that's not just an error, that is absurdity. It is senseless speech. Error is merely going wrong and presuming that something is past or to come. But when we make a general assertion, unless it is a true one, the possibility of it is inconceivable.
I don't get it. Right? We can't make general theoretical. It sounds like he's equating bad theory with self-contradiction. But I think we need the examples.
All right. Read the example. Thus,
if a man were to talk to me of a round quadrangle, qualities of bread in cheese, immaterial substances, a free subject, a free will, or any sort of free other than freedom from being hindered by opposition, I wouldn't say he was in error, but rather that his words had no meaning. That is to say, absurd. There's a footnote. Well, I don't know.
These are by the editor. We can just
we just skip that. But okay, so a round quadrangle, that seems to be an example of just a self-contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
Qualities of bread in cheese.
Okay, well, I mean that's where the editor's 2 is meant to be obviously faulty, while also being reminiscent of the Catholic doctrine that in the sacrament of the Eucharist, the qualities of bread are not to be found in the cheese, but in the body of Jesus. Okay. I don't remember cheese being involved in any Eucharist. It's involved.
So he's trying to. So it sounds like he's trying to refer to transubstantiation on the sly. So a kind of, theology, immaterial substances, and then we get philosophical stuff in 3 and 4, which straightforwardly lines up with what my previous association to analytic philosophers who think of metaphysical entities as forms of nonsense. I don't know how any of this exactly relates to what he was saying before about putting false generalizations into speech. I don't know. Can you explain that?
Well, I mean, the round quadrangle is not merely false, but necessarily false. And I think this is what we're going to get at, is that if you have a strict theory of causal determinism, then everything that in fact happens is necessary that it happened. We might not have known that. So if you are opposing a necessary claim. I'm just trying to think in other contexts, right? When somebody's trying to argue Descartes or somebody's trying to argue that it is necessary that God exists, then if you deny that, I could see Descartes or someone saying, you're actually contradicting yourself, right? Because there is the nature of necessity is such that, what does that mean? That you're affirming it? Even as you deny it, you still affirm it. And so it would have to be something that, is absolutely necessary, that there be no necessary connection being between the putting down of the bowl and putting the food in the bowl, right? Those are just two distinct, by their very natures, they are distinct actions that someone could have very good reason to usually perform together, but they're still distinct actions. It's not like putting down the bowl means putting down a material object, right? Because
he doesn't give an example like that, though.
No, I'm just trying to relate this to maybe we need to come back to scientific generalization.
Yeah. So
this is what he brought up at the beginning of the paragraph.
Right. No, I know. No, you're exactly right. This is why I'm confused. He does seem to say that he's any sort of theoretical generalization that's false is nonsense, but that's not what he's doing in these examples. He has contradictions, and then he has these metaphysical entities which don't, on his view, have any reference, right? So, and that's the nonsense, right? Of the, it's like Russell and the bald king of France. The bald king of France, I forget the proposition, is playing golf.
The present king of France.
The present king is bald. Sorry. The present king of France is bald. Is not just false. It's nonsense because there is no referent for the present king of France. So
unless you interpret it as there is such an X such that it is the king of France and it is bald, and then it's just false. Because
right, which I think is ultimately Russell's. Yeah,
yeah,
that's Russell's breakdown ultimately, and definite descriptions and all that. But I think that idea of senselessness and nonsense having to do with the failure to refer persisted. But in any case, that sounds like what he's doing here. He's distinguishing merely false propositions from propositions that fail even to refer to something.
I mean, is he though? Because it said, again, the beginning of that paragraph before the example is before you put it into the form of a proposition and merely have an expectation, that could be an error. But as soon as you put it in the form of a proposition and it's false, then it's actually nonsense. This seems hopelessly confused, but I'm going to be charitable here and say that, there's a sophisticated understanding of the difference between a merely factual claim and a necessary claim, a modal claim, that he's denying. So he's going to say, if a proposition is false, it is necessarily false. Therefore, it is nonsense.
Well, Well, then any proposition would be false. Any proposition that's false would be nonsense, not just general ones.
Yeah. Well.
So I don't.
Oh, okay. A particular.
Yeah. So maybe this will get clearer as we read on, but because it would be a very weird thing to say that general theoretical propositions that are false are also always nonsense. That it's because, right, strictly speaking, Bohr's version of the atom it's useful, but it's not entirely on target. And the same thing could be said with Maxwell's equations. All these things are strictly speaking false, but they're not nonsense at the theoretical level. And even if Maxwell got it entirely wrong from the start, is that nonsense? Is that like a round quadrangle? No. So we'll have to read on and figure out what he's saying.
I do almost want to push back on just this hard distinction between singular propositions. Like, is there such a thing as a singular proposition at all? Right? Because if the dog is expecting the food to come into the bowl, but once we say the food will come into the bowl. Unless those are just stand-ins for A will come into B, and by A and B, I mean these particular things right now. I'm not saying anything about them, but presumably the expectation is there because of the general rule that supposedly is in place. And so it's making a general statement about food in general and bowls in general. So even saying this specific food will be in this specific bowl, the only reason you would be able to say that at all is because you have some root in a general proposition. And so even voicing the singular proposition.
You're talking about induction and prediction, though. I mean, a singular proposition is like the cat is on the mat. That's his past, or even his, the cat will be on the mat. And he says past or future or expectation. The cat will be on the mat. The cat was on the mat. But the cats are on mats in general at this particular time. I don't know. Hopefully this will become clear.
I mean, the cat has to be the sort of thing that could be on the sort of thing that is a mat. That at least is implied by the singular proposition. No proposition.
If it's the soul is on the mat. That would be an example of one of his nonsense propositions.
Yeah, I guess I'm getting at this sort of Quinean holism of meaning thing, that you can't just really make a singular proposition in words, in concepts, without invoking universals, right? Locke makes that point as well, that you're already, and Hegel, that as soon as you try to say something very specific, the sense perception part of the Hegelian dialectic, then actually you've pulled in concepts which are universals and you've opened a whole new can of worms.
I think for Quine, right, though, it's about truth. It's about the truth of a proposition depending on experience in general, or on the truth values of all the other propositions in general. Right. So it meets the tribunal of experience as a whole, let's say.
Do we want to look at we talked about the round quadrangle, the qualities of bread and cheese, immaterial substances. We have this argument from Berkeley that material substance is a self-contradictory thing, that it actually is like a round quadrangle. And so no doubt Hobbes is going to say exactly the opposite, that, to be a substance is to be a material thing. And so it's just like a round quadrangle. And I guess the same thing is going to be a freedom, right? That because he's a strict determinist, then it's going to be, if you wonder, does this action that I just took that felt very free to me, did that actually have a material cause or not? And it just, on his theory, has to be the case. It is a mere absurdity if you say, I could have chosen to do something else. You're not just wrong about that. You are making a conceptual mistake.
Well, yeah, you're positing, so he's working within a naturalistic framework in which every effect has a cause, everything is caused. And so once you start positing entities that transcend that framework, that lie outside that framework, which would have to be the case for free will to be effective, right? We need that soul or substance that stands outside of the causal order. Then, yes, for him, you're positing an immaterial substance, a metaphysical entity, and something that is nonsense, right? So,
I'll keep going.
As I said in chapter 3, man surpasses all other animals in this. When he thinks about anything whatever, he is apt to inquire into the consequences of it and into what he can do with it. And now I add this other degree of the same excellence, that is something else in which man surpasses the other animals, though really it is a development of the inquiry excellence just discussed. It is that man can, by the use of words, get the conclusions he arrives at into general rules called theorems or aphorisms. That is, he can reason or calculate not only with numbers, but with things of any sort in which one can be added to or subtracted from another. Okay, it sounds like a restatement.
This though is making me think that the problem that I was just pointing out in the cat is on the mat, or the food will be in the bowl, or something as invoking general terms is against that he seems to think that even a general term is just a name, right? You can,
right. He's a nominalist, right? Is that right?
I mean, if that literally means that the name of a general term refers to.
Well, there are no universals. There are only particulars,
yes,
ontologically, and then Okay, all right. Shall I keep going?
Sure.
But this privilege is lessened through being accompanied by another, namely the privilege of absurdity. Absurdity besets no living creature except man, and among men, the ones who are most subject to it are the philosophers. For what Cicero says of them somewhere is most true, that there can be nothing too absurd to be found in books by philosophers. The reason for this is obvious. It is that they never begin their thinking from the starting point of definitions or explanations of the names they plan to use, which is a method that has been used in geometry, making its conclusions indisputable, and hasn't been used anywhere else. I shall now list 7 causes of absurdity. So again, this idea that you can just lay out your axioms and postulates philosophically and then build up your system from there is actually not workable. And it's not how philosophical reasoning works. It's not even how science works.
The first clause of absurd conclusions is the lack of method, or anyway, of the right method, in that they don't start from definitions, that is, from settled meanings for their words, as if they could make up accounts without knowing the value of the numeral words 1, 2, and 3.
Okay, so let me just stop there. So when we, the Meno's paradox comes to mind, right? And it's the case that we often have a vague conception of something, which then becomes an object of inquiry, and we know and we don't know it at the same time to begin with. And that has to be the case, or else it couldn't become an object of inquiry. We wouldn't know what we're inquiring after. So we start out with these vague conceptions of some object of inquiry, and then we try to make it more precise. And we can do that through conceptual analysis as philosophers, right? We can do that through experimentation as scientists. But what we're not doing in that process is simply saying, I'm going to scrap everything and lay out a bunch of axioms like in Euclid and then build up from there. I mean, we might do that if our conceptual analysis was already complete. We could go back and show how all the elements, all the things that everything has been analyzed into, build the world back up, construct the world from the basic elements. But that's not the method of reasoning that is actually available to us as philosophers. And some people will treat this, even today, people often act like that. They want to say, in agenda debates, for instance, you have people running around saying, well, what do you mean by woman? Give me a definition of woman, or we can't even start to have this debate. Well, what a woman is actually turns out to be at an analytical level, very complicated. We know, we think we know what we mean, and we know woman when we see it and all that and blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't mean that we can give a coherent scientific and philosophical explanation of what it is to be a woman. And there is, I think there is, it is the case that there is something that it is to be a woman. And you could say, well, I'm going to reduce it by definition to biological sex and then start from there. But that forecloses the inquiry. So you don't define your way out of the problem. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to bring up like the most controversial. It's just the one that occurred to me. I'm trying to get into a controversial political subject, but you see what I mean. It's very relevant to the way that people approach these things today. And it's a faulty approach.
Well, and I'm trying to figure out just by looking at his previous chapter on speech, where these names are supposed to come from. He's already said in this chapter that they're just socially agreed upon. And so in that sense, woman seems to be one where, at least before the issue of trans came up, there was fairly widespread agreement on, and it's even dependent that somebody who is a trans, has trans feelings and wants to be the sex that they are not, they also are acknowledging, like, oh, I know the difference between a man and a woman. I just want to get in on the woman thing. Like, so
I don't think it's as widely agreed upon as people often think. Because people aren't just thinking of biological sex, they're thinking of masculinity and femininity and masculine and feminine traits. And that makes it a very complicated subject. And then as a matter of, right. So I think we should think of Kripke here, where we think of entities as having essences in a sense, right? We could ultimately, quote unquote, give a real definition of them, which is just to say, define the essence. But we don't know that up front. What we know is, okay, water has there's something called water. It has these properties under these certain conditions, like clarity. And if we could discover the essence, if we could do the work, then we would discover it had some sort of essence, like H2O, right? If we could say what it is. So what we know is that it's this defined entity, that there's this dynamic causal substrate that's regular, that gives it that accounts for the regularity of the properties that it has under certain conditions. And that it is, quote unquote, therefore a real thing. But you understand what I'm saying? So we can socially agree on the term water. We can have it refer to these, what may turn out to be superficial properties. We can have the assumption that it corresponds to an underlying essence, but know nothing about the essence underlying it. Know nothing about H2O until we get scientifically advanced enough. So we could all agree that there is such a thing as it is to be, there's such a thing. It's meaningful to talk about what it is to be a woman. There's even an essence, but, and maybe we think we have some ideas about what that essence is. But if we were to get Socratic about it and examine it, we discover that we're actually quite conflicted and confused about that essence. And we need some sort of philosophical and scientific inquiry. And one ought to write a book about what we mean by woman or man, for instance. And so that's my point. I don't know.
Yeah. So the question is, can Hobbes profitably simplify and say, okay, we don't know everything about water. We don't know that it is H2O, but we know enough. We have pragmatic agreement such that we can therefore use water as a component in complex phrases. Like, again, I'm still sort of taken back to, but then ultimately when you're trying to do science about it, and he's going to want to say, if you are wrong and you say water is necessarily blah, blah, water is, merely HO, then you are not just wrong about that, but you're absurd because you are putting together that I still do not understand yet at all. Like, but you've used the wrong method to get there is what we've gotten so far out of him. If you make a factually inaccurate claim of that sort, you are not paying attention. I mean, it's such a complicated thing of what sensory experience reveals that something has a particular chemical layout, right? It's just like reveals that the earth is in fact round, is you have to make some sort of abstraction and say, well, if it had this chemical layout, then I should be able to, and I'll say how long it's been since I did any chemistry in a lab, but you perform dialysis, right? And you can separate out the hydrogen from the oxygen. And then you see that you've got twice as much, mole wise, right? Twice, because they're going to have different densities, but you can have twice as much of one as the other. And that's how they found that out. And you did something wrong if you came up with the wrong ratio. So the ratio is something that if you're using the correct method, you should be able to, don't know what, infallibly, but like repeatably figure out. And yeah, so I think there's nothing in here that he's being abstract enough that he could be giving something that is completely compatible with the Baconian scientific method. Do you disagree? Seems like he's trying to capture that spirit.
Yeah, I'm still too confused about that part.
All right. Well, I think we need to stop here, and we can continue on the 7 causes of absurdity next time. I don't know. Do you enjoy this reading enough? It seems like
a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we will do some more of this. Thanks, folks, for listening. Catch you next time.
Thank you.